As we begin our first panel for today, I just want to say thank you again to Cecile Watson, who really gave us a brilliant start to today's discussion as she spoke on executing the board strategy. And now panel one is going to deal with the issue of differentiating board strategy from organizational strategy. Our moderator is Kimberly Erriah-Ali, and we have three panelists, Charlene Osborne, Dr. Sandra Osborne, forgive me, Sandra, uh, Sandra Osborne, Dr. Charlene Sharpe, and Brian Glasgow. I will now introduce Kimberly briefly, who will then introduce her panel. So Kimberly Erriah-Ali is the Group General Counsel and Corporate Secretary for Republic Bank Limited and Republic Financial Holdings Limited. She's an attorney at law with 23 years of experience, having received her Bachelor of Laws with honors from the University of the West Indies and her legal education certificate from the Hugh Wooden Law School in Trinidad and Tobago. Kimberly was admitted to practice as an attorney in Trinidad and Tobago in 1998. And her full profile is available in the agenda we have sent to you. So Kimberly, I would now like to hand over to you and invite you to introduce your panels.
Okay, thank you, Kamla, and good afternoon to everyone online and to our distinguished panelists, who I'm very pleased to introduce this afternoon. With us, we have Sandra Osborne, who is a senior counsel and chartered governance professional out of Barbados. She has over 40 years experience, 25 of which was spent in a highly dynamic environment in the financial services sector. She is currently the chair of the Barbados Revenue Authority. And apart from her current professional, positions, with a firm belief in the power of sport to transform lives, she has leveraged this professional background to develop a second career as a sport administrator, both locally in the island of Barbados and internationally with bodies such as the International Tennis Federation and the Commission, the Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Commission of the International Olympic Committee. So welcome and good afternoon, Sandra. We move on to Dr. Charlene Sharpe, who is a distinguished academic with a background in geography and environmental science and public administration. She earned her PhD degree in geography from Rutgers University, where she focused her research on food security, climate change adaptation, hazards management, and community resilience in small island developing states. And thank you for that, because we know the region definitely needs that today. And beyond academia, Dr. Sharpe's governance experience is extensive. She's served on several boards in the region, and she is currently involved as a consultant with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So good afternoon and welcome, Dr. Sharpe. And last but by no means least, we have Brian A. Glasgow, who is an insolvency practitioner with extensive experience in financial restructuring and international litigation. He's formerly a partner with KPMG in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, and now serves as a consultant to Interpath Advisory, a global financial restructuring firm. He has handled numerous local, regional, cross-border, and multi-jurisdiction restructured engagements, including assignments under the US Bankruptcy Code, showcasing his expertise in navigating complex financial challenges. Beyond his professional commitments, Brian has made a significant contribution in the business community. He's a past president of the Chamber of Commerce in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and serves as the honorary consul to Sweden to this St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we want to say welcome to these three panelists on this topic of differentiating board strategy from organizational strategy. I think this afternoon we're very interested to hear what we anticipate to be very diverse perspectives from your own exposure to boards. And in the context of this topic, how you see them fulfilling their role as directors, as fiduciaries, and even encompassing these new elements of environmental and social impact and how those things impact their role on boards. We will hear this afternoon your views and opinions on whether you think boards understand or to what extent they understand the measurement of their own objectives in this regard, how they tie it to the organization's strategy and its targets. And so we're very interested to kick off the discussion. Just from a housekeeping point of view, we will ask each of the panelists to speak, and we will take any questions after the session, has concluded with their own interplay of comments. So without further ado, I will want to start the conversation with Sandra.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks to Kamla as well. I heard you say in your opening remarks that you were hoping for some diverse views, and I'm sorry that I'm going to have to disappoint you by saying that I agree so fundamentally with a lot of what Cecile spoke about this morning, so forgive me. But I'd certainly like to acknowledge Cecile's very insightful presentation. I wholly support many of the points that she's made, and in a sense, what she's done is identified the key governance factors that are critical to company success. And I found her approach was compelling and fresh and is certainly to be commended. What Cecile has described as board strategy substantially aligns with what I describe as a governance architecture or a framework, which of course, I think we all know are a set of processes and structures by which a board provides stewardship, leadership, oversight, guidance, and so on to ensure that the company will achieve its purpose and is viable in the long term within the bounds of ethics and law and so on. Very familiar scope in terms of what governance means. But there are 3 points that I would like to make in relation to board strategy, and then I'll just do a wrap-up comment in relation to organizational strategy. The first point in terms of board strategy, I think, is to understand the purpose that board strategy or a governance framework serves. And in my view, it is to ensure that the board is effective. That is, that it fulfills its stewardship role effectively, as without this, it's unlikely that the company will optimally fulfill its purpose. And so the framework is therefore, or the strategy, as Cecile calls it, is shaped by the fundamental role of the board in governance and is intended to ensure the effectiveness, their effectiveness in fulfilling this role. But the role does not exist in a vacuum. And I think we all understand that it is circumscribed by 2 basic legal duties that directors owe to companies, the fiduciary duty and the duty of care. So that's my first point, that it's all about, the whole reason why we're talking about this is to make sure that a board is effective in fulfilling its role. The second point that I want to kind of flesh out from all that we're talking about in relation to board strategy is that I think it's important to recognize that without the proper behaviors and the proper engagement, and Cecile spoke about that a little earlier, as well as the necessary supporting governance structures, that a board is unlikely to be effective. So it starts with the champion, and Ronell's, call that word. It starts with the champion, but it must extend to the board as a whole. So behaviors, engagement, I think, and really appreciating why you're here and what is your role. My third point is that the strategy or the framework must be comprehensive in scope, but scale to be fit for purpose. So it should, for example, determine who sets direction, who makes the decisions, who monitors progress, who is accountable for performance, and of course, the relationship between the board and management. So the framework, I think it's essential that the framework be documented for clarity, to ensure that it is understood and shared as a common approach to how the board conducts itself and conducts its business. And so in terms of that comprehensive framework, I would say there are about 4 essential components. As I see it, Cecile has dealt with them in a slightly different way, but in terms of my experience and how I have addressed this topic is that I would say 4 basic areas. First of all, I think, and it was on one of Cecile's charts, I think the whole question of the tone at the top and the ethical values need to be upfront in terms of what informs how the board functions and by extension, how the organization functions. And then the second critical component, I think, is all about the structures and that support the board strategy and the operations. So when we talk about structures, we talk about things like board size and composition, making sure that the board is big enough to be representational of its stakeholders, but yet small enough to facilitate effective dialogue. We want to recognize the importance of diversity and the need to refresh the board from time to time. I mean, we can say a lot about these things. I think everyone is very familiar with a lot of these concepts. Of course, the whole question of having the right competencies on the board, the right skills and experience, which enable directors to understand the industry, understand the environment, understand the risks and the emerging trends. All of this will facilitate proper guidance and oversight of management. And as important as the structures is the commitment to good boardroom dynamics. And I mentioned that earlier. That's about behaviors. That is about having the desirable personal attributes, the interpersonal and leadership skills, and a commitment to director education and ongoing training. And I think that, of course, in that regard, there's a recognition of the need for directors to understand and to come to terms with the ever-changing business environment that they may be dealing with. And all of this, of course, is with a view to making sure that their effectiveness is optimized. The third component of the architecture or the strategy will, I think, assist the board in fulfilling its role by setting out specific responsibilities. Of course, the most important of those would be setting the company's strategic direction, managing risk, ESG, making sure the company fulfills its purpose, long-term viability and success, and of course, value creation for shareholders and wider stakeholders. And in this connection, managing a board agenda, which is linked to board responsibilities, is an essential tool. Another responsibilities will, of course, include things like ensuring that the board has processes to manage, that there are processes, not that the board has, because obviously the whole question of internal controls is a management responsibility, and also making sure that succession planning and human capital at the senior levels are properly being managed, as well as oversight of performance, financial and otherwise, stakeholder engagement, and so on. As I said, a number of these things Cecile has already covered in her presentation. And then, of course, the last component of that framework, I think, is rightly so, as Cecile says, about performance and accountability, which requires, of course, board evaluations designed to measure board effectiveness, coming back to my first point. And just as critical, and I think that the earlier discussion also touched on this, addressing individual and collective weaknesses by appropriate interventions, whether those interventions are targeted education and training or some other form of intervention. But at the end of the day, I think that the whole purpose is a positive focus rather than a "I got you" exercise. It really is to enhance board effectiveness. And I think that once we keep that perspective in mind, then we understand the context, the wider context within which you will want to evaluate performance and come up with corrective action. So I'm kind of conscious of time, so I'm going to close with those 3 points on-board strategy, and would be happy to expand on any of the points during the discussion. But I think that having talked about strategy, it is quite clear that it is very different from organizational strategy. And you know, we understand the execution role and the actual delivery role that the management plays in terms of executing the strategic plan of the organization. And my final point would be to say that in the context of the organizational plan, we need to make sure that the board understands its role in that plan as well. Because even although they are not executing the plan, they have oversight. And so they must therefore understand the business environment. They must set a strategic direction that's appropriate for the organization, and the ethical values we talked about already. They've obviously got to prove the plan, monitor progress against measurable metrics, all with a view to the long-term viability of the organization. Well, as I said, leaving management to the actual day-to-day operation and execution and reporting to the board. So with those few comments, I think I'll just wrap up and be happy to pass it back to you, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I feel like that was a very, while short, it was a very end-to-end sort of insight on the board having its own sort of plan around, you know, how it executes its function, not only tied to strategy, but for its dynamic and, you know, functioning as a board. So thank you so much for that, Sandra. I will move to Charlene for her insights. And like I say, after the three panelists have, you know, put forward their views, we will then get into a discussion, you know, to take into account our listening viewers, you know, views. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I could possibly just say ditto, because I agreed with everything Sandra said. I've agreed with everything that Cecile said. Cecile's presentation was just so brilliant. And I'm also grateful for this opportunity to participate. It's really a privilege to be on this platform. Thank you so very much. Now, I'm coming from geography. And I'm realizing as I listen that within academia, we tend to compartmentalize everything, all of our disciplines. We tend to be studying the same things, you know, but we're studying it from different angles. And as I listen to this concept of strategy, and I'm listening to the jargons and, you know, the different ways in which we're understanding the world, the different constructs and the problems, more and more I'm realizing why it is so important for us to be seated at the same table, even though we're coming from different perspectives. Because here we are looking at this concept of strategy. And I thought about it for a while, and I came up with this little visual. So I'm thinking that since we're all coming from different backgrounds, it'd be nice to show that visual. Since we're all coming from different backgrounds, I'm from a geoscientist background. Some of you are from legal backgrounds. Cecile was from engineering and business and all these sort of things. Probably if we had a metaphor. If Amelia could share my visual, please. If we had a metaphor to see how we can differentiate, to help us to understand this construct of strategy, the board versus the organizational strategy, to ensure that we're all on the same page. What I am very clear about, which is what I'll speak to, then I'll probably give an example, then I'll tell you what I'm not so clear about. So those are my 3 points. What I'm clear about is that it is possible that we have an elephant and we're all touching different parts of the elephant, not realizing that it is an elephant. We're just describing. Somebody's describing the air, because as a geographer, I'm sure they're going to be describing probably the tail or somewhere. You know, so if you look at the visual, you have the aircraft, you have the control tower, and you have the map. To what extent is the board really the control tower? The aircraft is the organization. And what we're seeing to the extreme left, which could be the map that the control tower has, the pilot has, that really is the strategy. the aircraft would represent the organization. And we have the captain, the crew, the passenger, the mission. They must have a strategy as to where to go, time to get there, the best route to get there. They must have some sort of expertise there, because the captain will have to be concerned with things like fuel burn and the weight of the aircraft, the altitude, the speed, all these sorts of things. But once that aircraft gets into the air, then control tower takes over. To what extent is that the board who organizes now the aircraft within the airspace, within the zone of operation? It's a control tower that really dictates altitude and dictates path and tracks the aircraft until it lands. It is the control tower that ensures that the aircraft is not violating other jurisdiction or crashing into other aircrafts or, crashing on the ground, etc. It is telling the pilot what to expect, what the atmosphere, the cloud cover, what it is that we're going to be seeing. To what extent then should not the control tower also have its own strategy? So the strategy between the control tower, or differentiating the strategy between the control tower and the aircraft, must be clear. So, Cecile, you hit the nail on the head. Of course, there is the atmosphere around it, the skies. That's the environment in which we're operating. Thank you. That's the environment in which we're operating. And you can imagine that the control tower would have hundreds of planes that they would need to be, navigating the space, that they would need to be overseeing, etc. It is just like the board. So they must understand that environment. So the map, did I tell you that I'm a geographer? Is the strategy. The map is the strategy. Of course, you must have collaboration between what's happening in the air tower and what's happening in the aircraft, because we want to get persons from place A to place B. So they must operate together. So that much I understood as a geographer. I can't let that escape. As a geographer, I understood the map concept. I understood the metaphor very well. I understand the oversight, the insight, the foresight, the hindsight. I understand all of those roles in the strategy very well. That was very clear to me. So clear to me that I could actually look back at the NSWME story, which is a National Solid Waste Management Authority in Jamaica. I could actually look back on that story, understanding that when a new board was put in 2016, the accounts at the time, the last set of accounts was from 2008. It was considered to be the most corrupt board in Jamaica. Nobody wanted to serve on that board. The staff was not performing, morale was low, etc. But the board, once a new board was put in place, there was a strategy. So the board had a strategy to turn the organization around, which was separate from the organizational strategy. Cecile, you'd probably need to speak to a Camille Facey and a Dennis Chung to hear what that board strategy was. But no, we're talking about a board that has accounts up to date and filed in Parliament, a board that would have won corporate governance awards, a board with competent staff, satisfactory audits, name it. But it's because there was a board strategy separate from the organizational strategy. So that I clearly understand. But what happens when such a super board leaves? Because as of this year, many of the champions, I heard Sandra and Cecile talk about these champions, and Kim, when these champions leave, what is going to happen? The strategy is still there. But what is going to happen to the board? How do we maintain? And then I began to think, what is it that I'm truly not clear about? What am I not understanding? And so I'm going to get a little philosophical. That's what we do in academia. We get philosophical. And I'm saying, within this environment, the skies, within what we're calling the regenerative capitalist environment, how should we understand this concept of strategy? Do we understand strategy as being constituted? In other words, to what extent is strategy like a discrete commodity that can be possessed or not possessed? The board has a strategy. The organization has a strategy. You can hold it in your hand. It's codified. Here is this strategy. To what extent this is something that is constructed and it can be deconstructed and reconstructed dependent on the environment? So the environment clears, clear skies or thunderstorms or whatever, then you now need to go back to that map. You need to go back to that strategy. New buildings are being put up, whatever, to reconstruct that strategy. What if your strategy, however, is not considered as something that is constituted and put together and can be held and possessed? What if we should consider strategy as something that is produced? Again, I started by telling you that when we come from these different disciplines, our jargons tend to be different, even though we might be describing the same things. What if strategy is produced? And when we talk about production within geography, we're talking really about these sets of power relationships. And if a strategy really is a set of power relationships, then to what extent can boards and organizations really have strategies? Because what they do have are sets of relationships that can only be realized through these social and political and economic relationships in which it is that they're engaged. So it doesn't matter what is on paper. It doesn't matter what plan you put down. What is really important would be these sorts of relationships that are being engendered as we move along this new regenerative capitalist triple bottom line neoliberal type of environment. Whichever way we take it, could it be that it's because we are understanding these constructs differently? Whatever the construct is, and for me, it is strategy. Could it be that it's because we're understanding these differently why we are not seeing the sorts of results as quickly as we need to be seeing them? Because, you know, on the boards, we have all these mixed competencies, which is great. But if we're all coming with our different understandings and our different ways of thinking and our different ways of touching the same elephant, is it that we need to back up and be doing other things before we get to this point of strategy? What I'm trying to reach for is, how do we therefore get a more coherent construct rather than strategy therefore being a map? Could we envision a compass? A compass that doesn't change due to human agencies, due to the changes in environments, due to structures. If we accept that we're in this VUCA world and, you know, the shifts in market and shifts in technology and cybersecurity and geopolitical realities, and we can be naming all of these shifts and the rug being pulled from under the board and under these organizations, if we're understanding that there's so much now in this new world that we do not know, there's little clarity at times on the path forward. If we don't have answers, if we don't have all the data we need and information is so incomplete, could it be that what we need really would be purpose and value? The values, going back to my yesterday's question, the value system. Is that what needs to be held steady? So that even when everything else is changing, even when strategies are changing, if our values are being held steady, and I think that is what is changing in the world today, if the values that we hold as a board, as an organization, if our purpose is clear, to what extent could our compass become that North Star to guide our feet back to the path? Because the boards that we have now, they're dealing with totally different things from boards back then. Our sustainability, therefore, I'm putting it to you, lies not so much in our plans and our strategies, even though those are important, but it's really in our values and in our purpose. And what is that value? It is the compass. Let me finish as I started. When we compartmentalize knowledge, when we use the same words, but they have different meanings, when we're coming from different traditions, it's important that we have these types of conversations. It's important that we have these coming together of the minds. It's important that we're all on the same page. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlene, for those perspectives. I think it really resonated for me personally as a CorpSec in a boardroom. I think, you know, the points of view you expressed around where do you begin, you know, and having that value, knowing your North Star, and even arriving at what that North Star is presents such a body of work for many boards, small and large alike. I think I can totally agree and understand what you mean, that you begin there and then you are able to build a framework around that. So it's sort of like the work before the framework. So thanks for those perspectives very much. And not to overtake the discussion to come, so I will just invite Brian to share his perspectives with the panel and listeners. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Kimberly. And wow, Sandra and Charlene certainly gave us a lot of food for thought, so really do appreciate that. I think it was during Cecile's presentation this morning that she mentioned, she referred to the book, Why Nations Fail. And she made the point that a country's historical experience influenced its behavior, and the comparison that an entity, a corporation's historical experience also would influence the way it performs. And that is entirely true. That is entirely relevant, because even within the Caribbean, we have different countries that have different historical perspectives, different experiences, and that to a large extent dictates the way that their governance practices are undertaken. Now, coming from an insolvency background, I often come in after the plane has crashed. And yeah, Charlene, I really did like the analogy of using the control tower and the aircraft, because when the plane crashes, the control tower is usually unharmed. Similarly with boards of directors, if and when the entity fails, the directors are unharmed. They don't suffer, or hardly ever suffer, personal losses. Now, Cecile also mentioned this morning, she referred to one of the contributors who suggested that very often boards are not held accountable for mismanagement, because you hardly ever hear of people ending up in jail for mismanagement. As an insolvency person, I can assure you that boards are often, very often, held accountable. I was involved in, for example, the liquidation of British American Insurance Company, which is a subsidiary of CL Financial. And without going into unnecessary detail, a number of board members were in fact held accountable. It's just that these items don't often make the press. We don't always get the media responding and reporting on what happens to boards that have failed their respective companies. Now, in terms of trying to get some background for this discussion, there's one thing that's very clear. There's not a lot of either empirical or academic information out there, especially in our Caribbean context. So to that extent, we welcome contributions like the one from Charlene, for example, which certainly will be a significant addition to the academic background of our corporate library and our corporate experience in our part of the world. Cecile, I particularly liked the way you set the context earlier this morning. And that context where you mentioned and demonstrated the relationship between organizational strategy statement, providing the input for the board strategy statement, which in turn generated the board alignment scorecards, the governance model canvas, and set the framework for value creation analysis. I think that explained to a large extent the relative roles of the board in strategy and the board strategy in setting strategy and organizational strategy in itself. In looking at the value creation analysis, for example, you refer to a number of areas, financial performance, there was customer value proposition, human capital, the impact on shareholders. And, I keep referring to our Caribbean context because you mentioned also the social and environmental responsibility. Now, social and environmental responsibility in our context in the Caribbean is markedly different from social and environmental context from North America, where we get most of our examples from. Our social context goes back to what I mentioned earlier about our historical experience defining the way we run our boards. And that is important because over the last 40 years, while there has been a lot of advancements globally in corporate management, I think we have been a little slower in our part of the world to embrace a lot of the advantages, a lot of the advances that have taken place. We are catching up at an incredible rate now. And within our Caribbean context, we have the larger economies, and I will include Barbados in there. So Barbados along with Trinidad and Jamaica, and of course now Guyana, and the Eastern Caribbean experience, which, while significant, at least to ourselves, is quite different from the experience in Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica, for example. So even within our peculiar experience, there are relative differences. But I think the crucial thing is to really understand what is the board's role in crafting strategy and compare that to what is management's role in crafting strategy. Because going back to the aircraft control tower analogy, management is the pilot. So management is flying the plane. The board, yes, Charlene, is still the control tower. But we need to look at what's the pilot strategy as the one piloting the organization, and what is the board strategy from a distance. And of course, the board is required to contribute knowledge, insights, and ideas. That's a given. But the board must also challenge management's assertions around strategy. They must challenge management's assertion on risk. And, risk is an emerging and continuously emerging school of thought that embraces every aspect of corporate governance. And it's up to management, it's up to the board of directors to challenge management's position on risk. So if the pilot thinks he can fly the plane regardless of a storm approaching, the board must challenge him or her. Management, the board is also required to engage in debate and ask penetrating questions. Push, test the thinking process. Don't accept what is given to you. And of course, the board has to satisfy themselves that management has thought through all the options, all the issues, all the risks again, and all the implications of what they're doing. And at the end of the day, it is up to the board to approve or not approve management's recommendations or require management to conduct more research and analysis. On the other hand, management, the pilot of the plane, who is the one flying the plane, must engage the board in high-level framing before making any recommendations. So it's an iterative process. It's not the old-fashioned process where the board came up with strategy and passed it to the management and management did it without question. There is a process where it goes backward and forward. And management is required to challenge the board as well. Management must frame the issues and provide the context, provide the frameworks. And most of our boards, most of our regional boards are multidisciplinary boards. People with wide range of experiences, qualifications. And management must tap into these resources. Management cannot see the board as an unfriendly group of persons. It is a process of working together with the board. Management is also required to bring vision and passion because very often management is as close to the shareholder group as the board is. And of course, in terms of developing a strategic plan, management's role in creating a strategic plan is fundamental. It's not the board alone. Management, especially in the context of present-day corporate governance, management must present a well-structured strategic plan to the board for approval. So, looking at the subject for discussion again, differentiating board strategy from organizational strategy. Yes, we understand that there are differences. One is a plane, one is a control tower. But at the same time, we recognize the need for goal congruence. The two boards, the two visions must align, the two strategies must align. The board strategy is, in my view, more of an internal strategy in regulating itself and managing itself, while organizational strategy is more focused on flying the plane. You know, making this thing work. So I think I will end there for the time being. But before I do that, I'd just like to go back again, Cecile, sorry for referring to you so often, but your board's beacon statement is very similar to an organizational vision statement, because you look at the purpose, you look at the vision, you look at the guiding principles, you look at the mission, and you look at the strategic priorities. So rather than differentiating board strategy from organizational strategy, I prefer to look at the topic in the context of understanding the fundamental differences, of course, but focusing on aligning the strategies for the benefit of the organization. So back over to you, Kimberly, and thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian, for those perspectives. You know, we heard a little bit more around how the historical context of companies have contributed, perhaps not to the strongest sense of governance. And I guess the discussion could, you know, probably continue on a bit on what do we think could accelerate some of the adoption of those advancements. We're hearing bits around the work that should be done, which I think my own view is that, you know, these things may be taken for granted, you know, sitting and sort of formulating values and core values, things such as formulating the skill set that a company needs, things in the on the board refreshing process around testing for values, you know, as sort of your first post for which your prospects must pass, so that we could sort of ensure that in the work of a changing environment that the board stays true to overseeing strategy, yes, that the management has to execute, but also very focused on its own framework and integrity as it goes along. So we now have our panelists back in, and, you know, I'd just like to open it up now for any perspectives from each of you on what your fellow panelists may have discussed. And we would then dive into questions from our listening public.
Maybe I'll just make a quick statement. I don't think it's a very profound one, but I think that, it was kind of interesting to see that the three of us approach this topic from slightly different angles, but at the end of the day, I think we all landed in the same place. And that probably is more important than the approach that we took to get there. And I think that it also, that what we've said also aligns very nicely with Cecile's presentation. So in a sense, I feel that we're on the same page in terms of what needs to happen, what we need to do. And it really is a matter of, you know, each organization, each company that's faced with leading the organization to make sure that we you know, put in place a framework a strategy that works for the organization and that makes sense. One of the things that I said was that it needs to be scale and fit for purpose. So whatever we do, however we, you know, whatever terms we use, at the end of the day, I think it has to work for the organization. It has to work for the company. And if that doesn't happen, then we're really and truly, you know, in a sense, not going very far. And then, of course, I think that what also came through was the fact that the human the willingness of individuals to be engaged and to make a difference, you know, it is also very critical to this process. So I just made those 2 points, you know, in terms of what I was able to pull out from the discussion.
Thank you for that, Sandra. Charlene, did you want to come in again on any of the points raised?
I was just so pleased with just hearing that as much as we're all coming from different perspectives, at least we're having some common understanding. What I'm wondering, just trying to take the analogy a little further. Who it is that the control tower reports to? And I'm not speaking in terms of an AGM per se, but is there a governing body? This is how you have the FAA. That's what it's called, the Federal Aviation Authority. Is there a super body that controls all governance? I don't know. I'm just asking.
Yeah. I'd like to jump in there because that's an interesting question, because I think that for me, I understand that there's certain regulated industries and that there are regulators to whom you've got to report and satisfy on certain governance processes. We understand that. But I think fundamentally governance is not about being policed. If you only respond to governance requirements because the policeman is waiting for you, then I think that you know, that you have a problem. So fundamentally, you need to recognize that, and I think that governance has kind of gone there. I just saw a message pop up about it's the public. Ultimately, I think it's about the stakeholders. It's about the fact that you are functioning and operating within a society, and that your product, whether it be a service or an actual physical goods, has an impact on people's lives. And therefore, there's a responsibility to your stakeholders, whether they be the shareholders themselves, who obviously have a particular focus in terms of value creation and, you know, creating value. Employees, a different focus. The public, the wider public, there is the, you know, they're your customers and your clients. I mean, so that there are, you know, a lot of pieces that make up who are your stakeholders, but it is basically a consciousness that I need to do right, as opposed to being policed by the regulator. And I think that the companies who only respond to the regulatory requirements are going to tick the box, whereas the ones who recognize the importance of having the right values and embracing stewardship and what leadership means and what looking after the best interests of the organization and the company is all about. Those are the companies that are more likely to be successful in the long term than the ones who just tick the box because the regulator says you must have a woman on the board, you know, you must have, you know, whatever. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandra. I really agree with that. Kimberly, forgive me a second. I wanted to interject because I also love that question that Charlene asked. And so in the context of what Sandra has shared, and I agree with her entirely, it can't just be about policing the organizations, because then you get that whole compliance approach. So I wanted to ask generally, but more so Sandra in particular because of her experience. What then is the role of, and can corporate governance codes fill that role that Charlene is asking about? So Jamaica has its own corporate governance code. Trinidad and Tobago is in the process of revising the corporate governance code. Guyana has a corporate governance code. I know Barbados too has made great strides in establishing. So would the codes then fill that area that is required to help organizations better know what is expected of them?
So I see the code very much like how I see a code of ethics. I see a corporate governance code like a code of ethics. What it does is provide guidance as to what the expectations are in terms of the processes and the systems that you need to put in place. That's what it is. So it's a tool that helps you. But the point is that it can't be, the reason why I am responding to this is because the code says so. It has to be that the code assists me in delivering what I'm supposed to deliver. It's like, as I said, the code of ethics, for me, is a really good example, because the whole purpose of a code of ethics is to really make sure that people understand what the expected behaviors are, so that we're on the same page in terms of what are the values of this organization, and therefore what are the behaviors that are acceptable and what are not acceptable. And a corporate governance code, you know, helps guide you. I spoke in my presentation about the need to have a framework documented for clarity. It's the same point. It's the same point. You know, it just helps you. It just helps you. It's like a strategic plan. If you don't have the plan written down, I'm sorry, just a couple of points. What are the goals? What is, you know, what is it? Where are we going? How do you get there? And so I see that very much as a tool. I don't think it you know, overrides the point that I made.
Thank you.
I want to agree with Sandra. Everything Sandra says is gospel, right? Once Sandra says it, it is gospel. I'm going to take it, right? But hearing Brian say that he would come in after the crash, and I'm thinking to myself, once there is a crash, who investigates, who ensures that it doesn't happen again? So even, we're not saying no self-assessment, we're not saying, you know, we ought not to be governing ourselves, etc. But who ensures that we don't have these crashes so often? I know that for the control tower, I think they give them, once they would have experienced 3 mistakes, they're out. You can no longer serve on a board. You only give them 3 strikes and then you're out. Is it that the code says something like this? I'm not sure. You know, and it's from that angle that I'm asking, do we have an FAA in place?
Well, you know, if, without resorting to cliches, but you know, we all familiar with the relationship between culture and strategy, and that culture consumes strategy. And unfortunately, again, in our part of the world, the governance system is often controlled by our subcultures. So while there are mechanisms in place, regulated entities for banks, insurance companies, and several other types of entities, very often our culture allows us to bypass the regulatory systems. And, you know, I'm definitely not going to mention anything like politics or anything like that, but the two are not unrelated. And until we can create a proper culture within governance, then no matter how much regulation, no matter how much code of ethics we have, we will continue to see crashes.
I think that's exactly my point. That is exactly my point, that it really is about the behaviors and the willingness to be engaged with the correct types of behaviors and approaches. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Yes, it is an awareness as well by companies to even ask themselves this, because many of them start up, and I would say that companies that have aspirations of growth, you know, and doing things like becoming listed, they may be more in the headspace of asking these questions, but certainly smaller entities may not. And I think the codes and maybe, you know, things that exist around duties and the Companies Act and so on would be great guidance for average company. In the regulated securities industry space, we have SROs that gauge, you know, how well listed entities are performing against their corporate governance codes. We had a great comment in the chat, if I could just shift a little bit to, you know, engaging with our listeners, by Latoya Garcia Henry. And I'd like to invite Latoya to give us her perspective on what she called the sort of black box exercise, which occurs after the crash, the metaphorical crash. So if Latoya could perhaps log on, thanks.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I saw Charlene smile as soon as you said black box exercise, because of course she knows exactly what I'm talking about. So in the aviation industry, when a plane crashes, a black box exercise, the black box is something that's held, I believe, in the cockpit of the plane. So it records data as a plane is flying in terms of, it will show a record essentially of the decisions that have been made by pilot, co-pilot, etc. Within the cockpit while a plane goes down. And an analysis is done after the fact in order to ensure that new standards can be set for airlines so that it doesn't occur. So Charlene was commenting on what similar body may exist. And what I was saying is that in the corporate arena, what really has to happen is that this black box exercise needs to be conducted by the boards that have not gone under. So when we have a large crash, and I'm thinking I'm going to use CLICO and the financial crisis because I think most of us within the Caribbean are more than familiar with that. When we have something like that occur, and that metaphorical crash occur in the corporate arena, the boards that are still running organizations that they want to keep alive have to look at their governance procedures, analyze what happened in the organization that has gone under, and swiftly move to make changes internally. This is where we are required to pivot. And it's not always easy, but I think coming out of 2008, both internationally and regionally, we saw the strengthening of governance. And that's what that black box exercise looks like, I think, in corporate.
Thanks for that, Latoya. I mean, indeed, again, an organization that is willing to be a learning organization is also one that's willing to do a root cause analysis or black box exercise when things are not going well, or to examine their peers in the market. We also had a nice comment from Roxanne Ford. If Roxanne is on, and she sort of touched on the fact that boards are usually, they come out of these episodes unharmed, and they were really carrying out their oversight function from which the crash occurred. We're taking the crash metaphor all the way now, Charlene. So if we could just hear from Roxanne a little bit on that. Roxanne Ford.
Hi there. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Let me get my camera on. So I worked at AIG. I worked in Trinidad. It was Algico at the time. And I remember when AIG's board got in hot water, the regulators were on them like white on rice, pun intended. And, they had to be held accountable. This notion that the board has oversight, we have to really insist on their oversight. A lot of us in the Caribbean, and I don't know if you all would agree with me, we see boards as like cushy things. People are on boards and they have no clue what's going on. And I think that era has passed. Boards have to be held accountable. Boards are accountable. One of my favorite things to do when I do my AML training with the board, they say they know money laundering. We have to do it every year. I give 3 slides. The rest of the time, I spend on some topic that's relevant to them and good governance. So we do the three now 4 lines of defense, try to speak to them to say, you have to be involved. You have to know, so that and I love, of course, we all love the control tower and airplane analogy, but the thing is, they're there for oversight. They are to avoid the crash. That's what happens in a control tower. Usually someone's not listening, or someone doesn't hear when they say aircraft coming in at 45 degrees right. Someone's not paying attention. But we have boards who are also not giving instructions, who are not are holding things to their chest, not sharing with management what they see, trying to protect their role. They don't want to speak out. They want to rock the proverbial boat, and I saw that years back, 2008, when you said 2008, went right to my head. My whole compliance career started as a result of malfeasance in AIG companies, where they just didn't have oversight. They had attorneys who would fix things that went wrong. And thus the emergence of the quote unquote compliance officer, who we sort of see as the guardrails, who protects things from going wrong. And I think that's why compliance officers report to boards. Similar function. You are the guardrails. you're supposed to stop people from falling over, stop planes from crashing as best as you can. You know, Murphy's Law says it will happen. But in listening to the conversation, I think that's really where we lack in the Caribbean in particular, where boards are, you know, it's a pinnacle position you've reached and you're there for your expertise. You're not there to stop stuff from happening. And I think it has to be a double-edged sword. We have to hold people accountable. We have to, when they get put on a next board after the last 2 companies they were on went down, we have to speak up. We have to, and regulators are holding people more accountable. Thus, the fit and proper assessment for boards now is so rigid. Based on international recommendations, Central Bank locally has put out new corporate governance guidelines that, although, as I say, I'm a compliance consultant, that's where my work takes me. So we've had to put in policies and procedures for boards, holding them accountable, ensuring everybody knows who's responsible for what, and not just, you know, so you have an audit committee, yes, things have to roll up into that audit committee. It has to be documented when things are addressed. And we're not just saying audit committee as audit per se, but compliance, things for oversight, things, start reporting breaches and holding people accountable and having that feedback loop where it's not just a lot of paper pushing and board hearing strategy and cheering and saying, yeah, they've got to be involved in the not so fun stuff too. You know, they've got to be, and I see Sandra put a smile on her face. Yeah, they've got to be held accountable and be made to have their 2 cents heard and held accountable when they didn't have their 2 cents heard and the plane crashed. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Roxanne, for those perspectives. Fully agree that the regulated sectors, you know, while to Sandra's point, it's not really that you ticking the box. I mean, it becomes culturally part of the profile of the senior leadership and your board members who must really be aligned with what the framework is. You know, you do have to do the right thing. And so you end up looking for that in your own candidates and your leadership. So it becomes an important way of onboarding as well. I wanted to just invite Cecile quickly to just chat a bit on her comment around the fit and proper assessment for board members, which obtains, at least in the financial services sector, through the region.
Yeah, so I made the comment in regard to the dealing with the black box, you know, as it happens across the world, really. The regulators always step in after the fact. So something happens out there and they discover, okay, this is a problem needs fixing. The regulators come to and they put regulations in place. We saw it with the Basel Accord. We see it with terms of even what Jamaica is doing now with their Twin Peaks regulatory framework. So basically what I'm saying is, in response to Charlene's question, there's no system out there that causes boards, directors to require to be eligible to function as a director. Of course, you can do your certifications, etc. But the very role of a director, I'm agreeing very much with Sandra, requires that you act as a fiduciary. Unfortunately, many people don't understand the scope of what that entails. So we come to the boardroom as professionals with specific expertise. That does not make us a good director. So I like to say that often you have very competent professionals, but you have an incompetent board because you don't understand I'd love to stick with the analogy, but Charlene, you're going to have to help me here. We don't understand the animal, the tower. We don't understand the tower. We don't know how to get up to the very top. We're not accustomed to understanding what the stairs look like or whatever. So we come in with our expertise, but it may not be fit for the purpose of the company where it is in terms of its evolution. That's why I'm positing the charge we need to start thinking of the board having a strategy that is aligned with the organization. making sure we understand what the organization needs to become, what it intends to become. Of course, we are weighing into that. We are given the steer. We are being engaged in that process. But then we have to step back and now and say, if that is what it is to become, how then do we orchestrate ourselves, how we practice our role in order to be congruent, have alignment, and to steer the ship exactly, steer the plane, sorry, exactly where we want it to go in terms of its destination.
Yeah. Kimberly, can I make a point?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I saw a couple of comments in the chat relating to the role of management vis-a-vis the board. And I think it's something that we haven't really had a chance to talk about too much, but I don't think that we can underestimate the importance of the critical role that management plays in ensuring that the board also performs its function and performs its role effectively. And, you know, and I think that Cecile mentioned in her presentation, Warren Buffett's comment about the most important job that a board has, I think, is to appoint the correct CEO. Because I mean, the CEO and obviously the team under the CEO is important. But the point is that it is very difficult for a board to function effectively unless management itself supports the role of the board. And, you know, so when we talk about the board strategy and the organizational strategy, I think that we need to make sure that we understand that the two actually don't function separately, that you know, the relationship between the two is not just integral, but it you know, in a sense, it's almost like a symbiotic. You know, the success of the company is dependent upon the board having the right strategy, and by the same token, the board, in order to be effective, requires a support from management in terms of the information, the quality of the information, the timing of the information that's presented to them, the honesty of the information. You know, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that engagement process to make sure that the board is able to make informed decisions in the best interest of the company.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Sandra. I mean, I agree with you. It is a, sorry, go ahead, Charlene. Yeah.
I'm sorry. You should probably go ahead.
It is indeed a symbiosis. And I think to one of the early points Cecile mentioned around assessments and the method of board assessments and that dynamic, even not even among the board inter se, but with the CEO and senior management is an important testing point as well. So it pulls out some of these potential areas for deficiencies around, you know, data, quality of data, what's presented, what I'm being asked to assess. So I think it's all very important. We wanted to, after Charlene goes, if I would just ask Alicia Graham to come on a bit after Charlene on the available information, which helps boards to make strategic decisions. Over to you, Charlene.
Thank you. Just last week, Michael Leachin, who owns the National Commercial Bank in Jamaica, he's a Jamaican-Canadian billionaire. He's made the point that the reports that he tends to get from management, they're so polished, he could see his reflection in them. So he's not bypassing management and going straight to the ground to speak to people. So if it is that we're expecting honest report from management, and management, I figure, wants to look good, management doesn't want to lose his or her job, how do we then ensure that this alignment, you know, the quality of the information that is coming across, that it is authentic and that it can be used and it's not leading the board astray? You know, is it that the board is not asking the right types of questions? What is it?
I mean, if I could just offer something, I mean, we spend a lot of time one-on-one with board members to sort of at their orientation, even to go through the data points that they would be exposed to and to sort of link that to the duty that they have to exercise. And along the way, we have found that even where additional education sessions have been needed for the board as a whole on how certain areas kind of get from A to B, we do the work, is what I want to say. You know, it takes some time, but you have to do that work to create the alignment. It is not sort of a one and done. You're appointed and, you know, well, what's all of this coming to me? There has to be that access. And again, the regulated industry sort of ensure that you have access to your senior leadership to ensure that you can ask the right questions. So it's really, you know, if I had to consider the unregulated sectors, I would sort of ask, how do we share that sort of similar, you know, approach so that there is similar alignment or the opportunities to close some of those gaps? Alicia, if you are on.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
All right,
afternoon. Go ahead.
I read a statement that I made. So being in the position of senior management, I've often come around where the information, there are instances where information can be provided that, if not pressure tests, and I call it pressure tests, being that you ask the right questions, because sometimes, even from my position being in risk management, I sometimes have to challenge those information that are going to the board, because one of my responsibilities is ensuring that the board is provided with all the relevant information. And as such, I have to ensure that I ask my fellow senior persons the relevant questions that the board, that I believe that the board would ask or would need in order for them to make informed decisions. And the other thing, I believe Kimberly and Charlene spoke about direct access. So of course you have direct access to management. We know the usual direct access is to the CEO, but also the board has direct access to the person who is head of internal audit or head of compliance or head of risk, and to obtain therefore obtaining certain information that is sometimes not even presented on paper for board meetings. So that's what I meant.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just scanning the chat for any other
Yeah, while you scan, Kim,
yeah.
while you scan, yeah, I just thought I'd just make the point that this whole question of information and data that is provided to the board, I think that, you know, I want to make the obvious point that it is so important to be able to critically pull out what is it that you want the board to focus on. And, you know, I have sat on boards where maybe 4 days before the meeting, 1,300 pages come in the board book, right? I've had 500 pages come in the board book. I've had 800 pages come in the board book, you know. And at the end of the day, I think that there's a lesson in that. What is the critical information that you need the board to focus on in order to make an informed decision? Yes, some people have a greater need for information and for data than others. I appreciate that. But at the end of the day, you know, one needs to focus. I'll just tell you a little story here. I have been for the last, maybe 9 years, I've been sitting on different boards in the UK. And the last one the very last meeting that I went to, the board book was about 500 pages. And this guy from New Zealand said to me, so why don't you use AI to help you through this board book? Why don't you tell AI that you're a lawyer, that you want to have a legal perspective, and that you therefore want this, you know, them to sift through the information in 10 minutes and give you the key points that you need to raise. But the point I'm making is that that really and truly, the issue for me is, yes, the data has to be complete, it has to be accurate, it has to be, you know, fair perspective of what's going on. But at the end of the day, you know, I think directors need to appreciate what do they need to focus on, given their experience and their background, in order to ask the right questions and to challenge management in the areas that they need to be challenged in, you know. And that to me is really what people who have, you know, engaged boards, I think, tend to struggle with that, you know, you throw 1,300 pages at a board without clarity in terms of what is the executive summary, what are the main issues that we need to deal with, you're going to be all over the place, all over the place. And that's what we really need to you know, those are the kinds of points that I make when I talk about supporting a board to function effectively.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sandra. I think it's all part of setting up the right framework, as we've been talking about. And these are elements that I think the chairman and CorpSec's office in larger entities anyway would sort of champion, you know, to ensure that there is clarity around the agenda. You know, what am I asking you to do? Making sure that there's timely submission of board packages, to your point about receiving 1,300 pages 4 days before a board meeting, and even refining how those packages are presented so that you get the most efficient board meeting that you can. And that is work to be done as well, you know, so it's a lot of questions that companies do have to sit and say, you know, if I want to have this quality of company and governance, this is the work that has to be done. And it is iterative. You may do it 1 year and take all of the feedback and realize, hey, I can improve this even more. So I don't, sorry,
Hi.
yes. Yes, hi, Faye. Good afternoon.
Kimberly, yes. Just wanted to jump in here because I fully endorse what Sandra has said. And I think that boards really need to recognize their responsibility in determining the information that comes before them and how it comes before them. There's so little pushback on the part of directors with respect to some of these information packages they get or demands for the information that they really need, which is why I think it's quite instructive that Kamala is going to be doing something on board papers towards the end of the year. We might have a bit of a long wait, but that is a strategic thing. The board needs to sit down and say, you know, is this the information we need? Because so many times you come to a board meeting and these packages are the same packages that have been there for, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, little tweaks here and there. And you have these lovely board portals and they're not really being used the way that they could be used with live and information. I nearly said entertainment, live information that directors can interrogate and slice and dice and see what it looks like. It's paper turned into PDF. And we need to move beyond that. And I think directors themselves have a responsibility to say, this is the information we want, and not just respond to huge packages that they get and wade through them. So that's my contribution.
Thanks so much for that, Faye. So we're about 5 minutes out from 2:30. I just wanted to invite each of our panelists in the order that they would have come on to give any closing remarks, you know, in a minute or so. And I would thank you for your contributions this afternoon. I think it fed very nicely into Cecile's deck as well. And I think we understand, you know, a lot of what are the good ingredients for companies sort of differentiating between that board strategy and organizational strategy. So over to you, Sandra, for any closing comments.
Thank you. You know, I have served on panels before at Kamala's invitation, and I suspect that what I'm about to say, I've said already, so y'all forgive me. But I think that, you know, we sit down and we talk about governance, but at the end of the day, it is so important that we not just internalize the principles, but that we demonstrate an understanding of what is expected of us in this space. And, you know, and I mean, it's pointless sitting down talking about all these issues if we are not prepared in some way to move the dial to the point where we address a lot of the issues that have been raised today. And I say that in the context that we must make sure that when we do so, that whatever we do is fit for the organization, is fit for the company that we're talking about, because there's no point in us embracing an elaborate governance architecture that's not fit for purpose for the particular industry or the size of the company or anything. So, you know, I think my appeal is really not about the knowledge so much as, because we all have it, we all know what's expected. I think it's really about how do you take that and turn it into something that's meaningful, so that you can say over you know, a particular period of time that I have contributed to moving that dial to more effective governance. Thank you.
Dito, can I just say Dito and leave it there? I think just given the fact that we're coming from different ways of thinking, as a geoscientist, I'm really just pushing for us to be on the same page, for us to take the various jargons from the different disciplines and ensure that the lexicon that we're now producing, that we're all defining the same the terms similarly. So when we speak about one construct, that we're all on the same page, understanding what that construct really says. And of such, having these conversations will definitely must continue. It was Henry Ford who says that coming together is a beginning. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. And what's the last part of that quote? Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress, and working together is success. I remember. That's Henry Ford.
Thank you, Charlene. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks. And you know, Charlene, in your substantive presentation, you used an example earlier of an organization, I think it was in Jamaica, where there was zero strategy. A new board of directors came in, developed strategy, and there was concern about what would happen when that board of directors left. And I think that demonstrates, you know, what we all say, in that strategy is a responsibility of the board, yes, but it's also a responsibility of the organization. And if the organization itself does not have the ability to construct a strategy, then you can't really expect a board of directors who, in most cases, the board of directors is changed from time to time. So your concern is that when the expiring board of directors leaves, what would happen to the organization? So you cannot have a situation where the organization itself is fully dependent on a board of directors to set a strategy. It has to be the board strategy enhancing the organization strategy and aligning its own goals with the organization strategy for the overall benefit of the organization. So back to you, Kimberly.
Okay, thanks for that, Brian. I think everyone who's listened in really enjoyed the perspectives. Like I said, it built very nicely upon the first presentation today. And I just, before handing over to Kamla, once again want to say thank you to Sandra, Charlene, and Brian for joining. I think it definitely was, even though we're all at the same place, it definitely was a diverse set of views. And I just feel good that we're all headed in the right direction. So that's a good place to be. So without more, I'll just hand over to Kamla, and have a great afternoon, everyone.